and welcome to NewsHour for the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm James Menendez. Coming up a little later, a treat for fans of the soul legend Booker T, who began his long hit-making career while he was still at school.
Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the UN's warning that Israel is in breach of humanitarian law following attacks on UNIFIL UN peacekeepers in southern Lebanon by the IDF, in which 2 Indonesian soldiers were injured when an Israeli tank shot up a UN watchtower. Joining us is Thanasi Cambanis, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and director of the Center for International Research and Policy. Until recently, he worked as a journalist based in Lebanon, and his books include A Privilege to Die, Inside Hezbollah's Legions and Their Endless War Against Israel, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story, and most recently, Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islam's Politics in Iraq, 2003 to 2023. Then we'll assess the impact of Hurricane Helene on North Carolina and the fire hose of lies and disinformation coming from Trump and Vance about FEMA and Democrats geoengineering the weather in terms of how it will affect Kamala Harris's chances of winning the state. Joining us is Jonathan Weiler, a professor of global studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the author of Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics, and his latest book, co-authored with Mark Hetherington, is Prius or Pickup: How the Answers to 4 Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide. He writes regularly at jonathanweiler.substack.com, where his latest article is The Pathological Endgame. Then finally, we'll look into the border industrial complex and the profitable business of immigration, as well as its human cost, and speak with Pamela Yates, an award-winning film director and co-founder of Skylight, a not-for-profit media organization that for over 35 years has combined cinematic arts with the quest for justice to inspire the defense of human rights. Among her films are When the Mountains Tremble, winner of the 1984 Special Jury Award at Sundance Film Festival, Teatro, State of Fear, Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, for which she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, Disruption, and 500 Years. She executive produced the Academy Award-winning documentary short subject Witness to War, and her latest film, now opening across the country, is Borderland: The Line Within. And joining us now is Thanasi Cambanis, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and director of the Center for International Research and Policy. Until recently, he worked as a journalist based in Lebanon, and his books include A Privilege to Die, Inside Hezbollah's Legions and Their Endless War Against Israel, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story, and most recently, Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq, 2003 to 2023. Welcome to Background Briefing, Thanasi Cambanis.
Glad to be talking to you on this grim day, Ian.
Well, it's been some grim days now for several weeks, and the war, Israel's northern border, as they invade southern Lebanon. I just was looking at a New York Times article showing video from a drone, I think, of the destruction of Lebanese villages in the south, which is similar to the kind of destruction that's happening in Gaza. It was pretty extraordinary. But now we're getting warnings from the United Nations of a humanitarian law breach by the Israelis after 2 peacekeepers were injured when an Israeli tank fired on a UN watchtower at a base in southern Lebanon. And the UN is charging Israelis, the IDF, with repeatedly hitting UN positions over the last 24 hours, including deliberately firing at security cameras that the UNIFIL, the UN interim force in Lebanon, have deployed. So, and of course, Israeli airstrikes continue in the south of the country and on Beirut. But what is the relationship with the UNIFIL troops? Have they been there, since 2006?
Well, the UNIFIL has been there since the early 80s. Their mandate was renewed in a more robust form after the 2006 war, but this mission's been there for at least 42 years and has been, among other things, the key interlocutor between Israel and Lebanon, or more specifically, between the IDF and the Lebanese armed forces. So they've played this really important role, partly of shielding civilians from harm during times of conflict, partly being the sole sort of neutral witness to violations of the supposed demilitarization of the area, and partly a really crucial diplomatic channel, deconfliction channel between the Israeli military, the Lebanese military, and Hezbollah. So that's what they've been doing. And there's been a real interesting push and pull in the way Israel has viewed these UN peacekeepers. So we know in general, Israel doesn't like the UN. They view UN agencies that are at work in and around Israel as ultimately constraints on Israel's ability to act freely. And usually Israel views them as somehow Trojan horses for criticism of Israeli policies. When it comes to UNIFIL, they've been a little more circumspect until recently because they really have seen the importance and the utility of having some kind of credible agent on the ground that can help these two very powerful military forces, the Israeli military and Hezbollah, deconflict and avoid accidental wars. What we're seeing right now is a reversion to the norm of the. So we're seeing Israel start to treat UNIFIL, the UN peacekeeping mission in South Lebanon, the same way it's been treating UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency in Gaza, and other UN agencies that operate in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and elsewhere in the region. So they're now treating it with the same effort to delegitimize, and I would say ultimately for them to argue for this mission to be shut down. The official Israeli position in the last couple of years has been that the UN peacekeepers are failing to actually implement UN Resolution 1701, the resolution passed in 2006 to sort of upgrade the mission and, in theory, to demilitarize southern Lebanon so that Hezbollah would not return in military force. The UN mission completely failed to accomplish that, and in fact has sort of continued in a bit of a zombie fashion to engage in some of its core functions while failing to actually achieve its intended strategic goal, which would be to turn this area into a demilitarized zone. So I think Israel is going to accelerate its effort to dislodge the UN from that area, just like it's really maybe succeeding at its effort to try and dismantle UNRWA in Gaza and replace it with some kind of Israeli military aid distribution network, which would be in the long term, it's part of a campaign to end the idea of there being a right of return for Palestinian refugees by eliminating whatever international agencies exist as an outgrowth of the rights of Palestinian refugees.
So the Israelis, are they arguing that UNIFIL, there are 10,000 UN peacekeepers in Lebanon from 50 countries have contributed their forces. The ones involved in the two peacekeepers that were wounded when an Israeli tank fired at a UN watchtower at their mission's headquarters, I believe they are Italian. There's about 1,000 Italian soldiers and I think 300 Irish as well. The Irish have been there for some time. They're also complaining. But the Israeli complaint is that that Hezbollah is able to basically, tunnel, bury their munitions and their rockets anywhere and everywhere and even close to UNIFIL bases. Is that their complaint?
Yeah, so there's a bad faith complaint and then a sort of legitimate complaint. The bad faith complaint is that somehow the UN is providing cover, political cover, or somehow literal cover for Hezbollah to rearm on Israel's border. I've never seen any credible reports backing that up. But the legitimate complaint, or the sort of credible complaint, is that Hezbollah was able, in defiance of Resolution 1701, to reconstitute a vast military infrastructure in the border region. And they did so in part by tunneling and building facilities right next to, or even sometimes maybe beneath, UN outposts. So this is, the UN in this case is being a sort of unwitting part of a Hezbollah plan, successful plan to rearm the border region. And so in this argument, they would say, and again with some they get some amount of sympathy internationally from this. It's not that the UN is complicit or doing anything wrong. In fact, they're behaving with fantastic amounts of professionalism in this very high intensity peacekeeping environment. And yet, by being there, they're actually not contributing to a resolution or de-escalation of the conflict. They're paradoxically or perversely creating the possibility or even incentives for Hezbollah and other militant groups to be able to reconstitute.
Well, back in 2006, an Israeli warplane dropped a 500-kiloton precision-guided bomb on a UNIFIL UN observation position that was manned by UN military observers from Austria, Canada, China, and Finland, many of whom were killed. And is that sort of lingering bad blood between the UN and Israel? I mean,
well, so in general, there's a lot of contempt by Israel for the UN, as there's a lot of contempt by Israel for international law in general. That strike in 2006, I believe that was a UNTSO position, and that is a small, very sophisticated mission that's been around maybe even since 1948, whose job is to monitor, neutrally monitor the status of incursions across borders. Israel had told them to leave. They had refused because their mission is to stay in these border positions even during conflicts, and they were bombed. And as you said, some of them were killed. In general, what I made of that at the time and what I make of these attacks right now against UNIFIL are that Israel wants to maximize its ability to maneuver and engage in warfare unencumbered by any accountability mechanisms, right? They do not want credible independent observers. They don't want journalists. They don't want peacekeepers. They don't want observers like the UNSO, people who are professional trained military or military intelligence figures from credible governments. They don't want such people and institutions in place because that creates the possibility of limits or accountability or consequences for violations of norms of war crimes, or just, politically or humanitarianly, acts that violate the norms of politics or humanitarian access. So that is why they don't want them there. And in the long term, I mean, we've heard some really terrifying and awful political debates underway in Israel about what they want to do in Lebanon. Netanyahu threatened to turn southern Lebanon into something the like as zone as destroyed as Gaza. Yair Lapid, the supposedly more reasonable opposition leader, has talked and written about reconstituting the Quisling South Lebanon army that Israel used from 1982 to 2000 to torture and police the occupied zone in South Lebanon. There are talks of having Israeli Jewish settlements in southern Lebanon by real political figures in Israel. So this is like maximalist talk that is, I think, just to be absolutely clear, terrible ideas, illegal, bad policy, bad strategy, bad ideas. They're seriously on the table. And so having the UN there is a problem for those in Israel who are proposing these kinds of open-ended maximalist ideas.
But there's more history of Israel striking at the UN in southern Lebanon. In 1996, in an earlier round of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, the Israeli military fired artillery at a UN compound that was sheltering 800 displaced Lebanese civilians, and 106 civilians were killed and 4 Fijian UN peacekeepers were injured. So again, there's more history of Israel's use of
a shocking disregard for the norms, even the minimal norms of respecting neutrality and some safe zones in war. And that 1996 massacre in Qana is a real touchstone for people who live in South Lebanon. There's a large memorial built on that site, and people regularly go there to pray or pay homage, and not just supporters of Hezbollah, right? Just regular people who live in South Lebanon see this as a symbol of the lack of regard for humanity and the right to live in southern Lebanon. And that is, again, what's at stake here. I mean, if Israel's attacking the headquarters base in Nakura on the coast, and I think the two peacekeepers who fell out of that tower were maybe Indonesian, according to some reports I read. So there's been Israeli attacks on maybe Irish, Italian, and Indonesian peacekeepers in this very sensitive area, and it is absolutely consistent, as you point out, with decades of enmity. And I think there are Israelis who would say the UN as an institution is biased against Israel. But I think, as we've seen in the recent vote in the UN General Assembly, where only the United States and Israel didn't support a vote for ending the war in Gaza, Israel might see it as bias. Most people might see it as like universal common sense that's only bucked by two very powerful exceptions to a worldwide consensus.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Thanasi, since you know this area very well and have written about Hezbollah, what is the Israeli strategy here, do you think, vis-a-vis retaliating against Iran's recent missile attack? Do you think they'd be satisfied with just trying to eliminate Hezbollah by bombing and invading, capturing territory and holding it, and trying to drive out the UN so that they have that buffer zone in the south? Would they be satisfied with this, or is there, certainly according to the statements from the right-wing figures in Israel, that would indicate that they also think that maybe this is the opportunity to knock out Iran's nuclear facilities, which of course would be difficult and probably would immediately lead Iran to building a nuclear weapon, since they've already got enough fissile material and probably could put a bomb together in a week or so.
So I agree with your analysis, but what I think is going to happen next is what Israel has said it's going to do. I think Israel sees this as a historical opportunity to essentially work through their most ambitious target list, unencumbered by restraints from the United States or anyone else. The sort of revenge-fueled maximalist bombing of Gaza that we saw a year ago, right after the horrible events of October 7th, quickly morphed into a systematic, strategic culmination of decades of Israel's most hardline thinking. So they've said what they want, and I think they're going to do it unless and until something physically stops them, and I expect nothing will in the short term. So they will finish the complete decimation of Gaza. They will annex the West Bank. They will heavily bomb and use ground troops to destroy and dismantle infrastructure in South Lebanon and southern Beirut to make it a place that is sparsely inhabited for quite a long time, and therefore easier for Israel to constantly police and attack. And I think they will strike the Iranian nuclear program. And this last step is one that's under discussion right now between the U.S. and Israel. There's this sort of back and forth over what the U.S. supports the bomb, but the U.S. has already sort of surrendered any move to limit them by saying, we prefer you not to bomb the nuclear programs because of all the risks that will entail, but also whatever you do, we'll have your back. So Israel's made clear what it wants, and I think that is what it will attempt. And then, we'll basically see in real time a test of these hypotheses that you just referred to. If Israel directly attacks the Iranian nuclear sites, how quick, and Israel and Iran decides its only path to security is to go for nuclear breakout, can it? And how long will that take? We'll actually find out, because that's the next stage in this decision to resolve by force all the long simmering political and security dilemmas that I would argue can't be resolved by force. But we're seeing an experiment by Israel with full U.S. support of what happens if you try to go to the max and resolve all of these complex dilemmas through violence.
But just in closing, though, Thanasi, you'd think that Biden would be absolutely, furious at the Israelis, and apparently he is, in terms of some of the salty language in his conversations with Netanyahu that we're hearing about. But the fact of the matter is that if Israel escalates against Iran to the point of either attacking the nuclear facilities or the oil facilities, there's no question that Iran will strike back and possibly shut down the Straits of Hormuz, or at least even attack the Saudi oil fields, which they've done before, and that the price of gasoline could be $7, $8, $10 a gallon at election time, which would certainly kill off Kamala Harris's chances of being elected. I spoke yesterday with the former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele. He also believes that Putin, along with Netanyahu, desperately wants Trump to come back, and he'll do anything, including find ways to raise the price of gas. So at the end of the day, do you think Biden is assertive enough, strong enough to stand up to Israel and stop them from destroying?
So two quick thoughts on this. I don't buy for a second that Biden wants to restrain Israel. If he wanted to, he could. All of these performative leaks about the salty language and the curse words, it's hollow and empty and meaningless, right? The U.S. has a 100% key to restraining Israel. The day the U.S. called Israel up and said, in a week, we're going to sponsor a ceasefire resolution at the Security Council of the UN, and we're going to cut off weapons flows to you, so wrap it up, they would wrap it up. It's a no-brainer. It's a power the U.S. has. It's chosen not to use it. So it's not that Biden doesn't have the juice. He is actually in favor of these Israeli actions. So that's the main thing to keep in mind. The only other important thought I have in response to what you just said is the most dangerous thing about this moment is that Israel has found little price to pay for escalating. At each stage, Israel has been warned, if you start bombing Yemen, the blowback will be enormous. If you attack Iran directly, the blowback will be enormous. If you escalate with Hezbollah, the region will enter a cataclysm. And each stage, it has done these things anyway, encountered no meaningful military resistance. The region has not, from Israel and America's perspective, come to a cataclysm. So there's a dangerous emboldening cycle where the extremists among Israel's war planners, among U.S. War planners, is to mistakenly think there's no price to pay. And of course, if you do go directly to war with Iran, of course they can completely disrupt, as you said, world oil markets in 1 minute flat. There's a lot of things that Iran and its allies can do that will be deeply problematic, not just for people's lives and livelihoods, but for the entire stability of the global system. And I see an increasing tendency to forget or overlook this, to sort of dismiss Iran and the axis of resistance as paper tigers because they've been unable to respond in effective ways to the escalations to this point. And this is the big danger, that we then have the belligerents, America and Israel, overlooking the profound risks and dangers that come with yet another exponential threshold crossing in the military escalation.
And the end of Kamala Harris's chances of becoming the next president. I thank you for joining us, Thanasi Cambanis.
All right, Ian. Good discussion as always.
And again, I've been speaking with Thanasi Cambanis, a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and director of the Center for International Research and Policy. Until recently, he's worked as a journalist based in Lebanon, and his books include A Privilege to Die, Inside Hezbollah's Legions and Their Endless War Against Israel, Once Upon a Revolution, An Egyptian Story, and most recently, Shia Power Comes of Age, The Transformation of Islamist Politics in Iraq, 2003 to 2023. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back assessing the impact of Hurricane Helene on North Carolina and the fire hose of lies and disinformation coming from Trump and Vance about FEMA and the Democrats' geoengineering of the weather in terms of how it will affect Kamala Harris's chances of winning the state.
Yeah, my blood's so mad, feels like coagulating. I'm sitting here just contemplating. I can't twist the truth, it knows no regulation. Handful of senators don't pass legislation, and marches alone can't bring integration when human respect is disintegrating.
You're listening to Background Briefing this morning. The Skinny will be up at 10:06. Hope you're having a great day. This is WMNF Tampa.
Again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Jonathan Weiler, Professor of Global Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the author of Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics, and his latest book, co-authored with Mark Hetherington, is Prius or Pickup: How the Answers to 4 Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide. And he writes regularly at jonathanweiler.substack.com, where his latest article is The Pathological Endgame. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jonathan Weiler.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the endgame, of course, we're talking about 26 days now to the election, and effectively Kamala Harris has not been able to campaign much in these last few days because of the hurricane in Florida. It's sort of unseemly, I think, to campaign while people are suffering, and it also makes it impossible for her to go down there and visit. She doesn't want to get in the way. So Mother Nature seems to be throwing her a curveball, and it did so earlier with Hurricane Helene, who really impacted not just Florida, but North Carolina, and all kinds of misinformation is being spread by Trump and Vance about FEMA withholding money, all this kind of just really disgusting garbage. Is it having traction, though, in your state?
Yeah, Ian, the short answer is I don't really think it is outside of the sort of bubbles that traffic in that kind of disinformation and misinformation anyway. I mean, I do know, there's a caveat, I do know that Republican officials, both officials in the affected counties and members of Congress who represent that part of North Carolina, much of which is quite conservative, are saying that the misinformation is undermining relief efforts. I know from the people I know who are living in some of the affected areas, they are certainly able to access the appropriate information about how to get water, for example, and where there are, drop-off sites for food and things like that. So, I mean, I guess I would say I'm hopeful that, at least for people who are not already sort of immersed in these kinds of conspiratorial bubbles, just on the ground, people are getting the information they need.
Well, the extraordinary thing is that Republican lawmakers have been really complaining about this torrent of misinformation about Hurricane Helene, including Representative Chuck Edwards, Republican of North Carolina, and he issued a statement debunking these myths. Quote, Hurricane Helene was not geoengineered by the government to seize and access lithium deposits at Chimney Rock. Nobody can control the weather. Now, you'd think such a message would be unnecessary, but I don't know the extent to which America has become an idiocracy. But
it is, Ian, a testament to where we are that such statements, as you just said, even need to be issued. And I did write about this in my most recent Substack post, that this is now a pattern. Republican office holders in Springfield, Ohio, putting out fires because of the conspiracies being trafficked in by Trump and Vance about what is and isn't happening there. And it's, everywhere Republicans on the ground are trying to govern, it seems, they're being undermined by the top of the ticket, because this is the stock and trade of the national GOP at this point.
Well, the question is, I guess, have we gone down the rabbit hole of idiocracy to the point where this is going to work? They're obviously pushing it hard. Trump is, and so is Vance. And North Carolina, up until recently, was considered a very potential pickup for the Harris campaign, particularly with the Republican nominee for governor being so tainted and so crazy, the so-called black Nazi. So do you think the hurricane could have reversed things for Harris? I mean,
yeah.
You do.
I mean, I guess I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, I think there's always the worry that just the sort of specter of disruption and chaos helps Trump, because Trump is just an agent of chaos and he thrives on it, seeks it out, tries to stoke it wherever he can. And insofar as chaos sort of activates people's sense of fear, that can, in this very perverse way, work to his advantage. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a political scientist at Catawba College in North Carolina, Michael Bitzer, and I just want to give him credit for this because these are his data. He wrote a blog post a few days ago. He's got a blog called oldnorthstatepolitics.com, in which he looked at the 25 counties that are the disaster, deemed disaster counties from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. And he looked at a breakdown of voter registration. And even though Asheville itself is a liberal area, those 25 counties all in all that are declared a disaster area because of Helene are overwhelmingly more Republican than the state as a whole. The disaster counties are 23% Democratic, and that's compared to statewide 31% Democratic. And so there are these very significant Republican skews. This is a white Republican conservative part of the state that is being most directly affected by the hurricane. So whether that will affect the ability of some people to vote there, I don't know, but that's, another factor in considering, an answer to your question, how this might swing the election.
But if Asheville is a blue dot in a red state or a purple state, will the Democrats in Asheville be able to vote?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, looking at all of the affected counties, in spite of the blue dot of Asheville, this is a very Republican-affected area. And I mean, I think the likelihood is that, cities like Asheville will get up and running faster than some of the less accessible rural and red counties that surround Asheville. So, I think this may all end up in the end kind of being, canceling itself out. But, and let me also note too, Ian, that the State Board of Elections, and this is just one of those things that I have to say just clearly distinguishes Democrats from Republicans. The State Board of Elections, which is more Democratic than Republican, voted unanimously yesterday to loosen, to revise things like deadlines for turning in absentee ballots, for allowing there to be more in-site polling stations, precisely to accommodate the disruption that might, affect voting in that part of the state as a result of the hurricane. And they're doing that even though this is a more Republican area of the state. So the State Board of Elections is, really is committed to the idea that we want people to have an opportunity to vote, and we know it might be harder because of the hurricane.
So what is you hearing about how people are reacting to Marjorie Taylor Greene's idea that the Democrats are geoengineering the weather to their advantage, which is hardly evident?
Yeah, I can't say specifically, like in that part of North Carolina. I know that in general, she is not interested in reaching a broad cross-section of voters when she says stuff like that, right? She is playing to the absolutely hardest core of her Trumpian base. That's who the target audience is. And I think most other people just kind of think it's, preposterous stuff. But what's upsetting and demoralizing about it, of course, is what we need our government officials to be doing right now is to be ensuring that FEMA is adequately funded and in ensuring that people have the correct information about what they need to do to make sure that their families are safe and they have the basic resources they need to get through the last few weeks, not having our major public officials spreading lies and conspiracy theories. So, this is who she is.
Right, but the misinformation that's coming out of the Republicans, out of Trump and Vance, about FEMA is such that they say that FEMA has no money, which of course is not true. But it's true that FEMA, after they've dealt with the latest hurricane hitting Florida, which has just happened, and they will have no money. So this Congress has to step up. And I'm wondering whether Florida is going to have, their election is going to be impacted, because the Democrats were thinking maybe they had a chance of picking up a Senate seat, although Rick Scott, unfortunately, is ahead.
Yeah, concerning Florida, I don't know specifically, the sort of partisan breakdown of the affected counties in Florida. I think more broadly in the state, that was probably going to be an uphill climb for Democrats anyway. I guess a sort of bigger picture issue, Ian, is how do voters perceive leaders stepping up to the challenge of a disaster? George W. Bush was very badly and appropriately adversely affected by his administration's failed response to Hurricane Katrina on the one hand. And on the other, I think Obama and the Obama administration's sort of quick and clear response to Superstorm Sandy in the final days of the 2012 campaign, and especially the fact that the Republican governor of New Jersey at the time, Chris Christie, supported those efforts, probably made people feel like, okay, this is a leader, and we're in good hands. And so, DeSantis, I think, is playing kind of, for his own political consideration, playing kind of a dangerous double game here, which is, on the one hand, he obviously wants to get assistance to the state. On the other hand, he can't resist joining in on these kind of demented conspiracy theories that have become so common in the party.
Well, Jonathan Weiler, I thank you very much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jonathan Weiler, who's a professor of global studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the author of Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics, and his latest book, co-authored with Mark Hetherington, is Prius or Pickup: How the Answers to Four Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide. And he writes regularly at jonathanweiler.substack.com, where his latest article is The Pathological Endgame. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking to the border industrial complex and the profitable business of immigration, as well as its human cost.
If you're traveling to the North Country Fair, where the winds hit heavy on the borderline. Remember me to one who lives there, for she once was a true love of mine.
See for me that her hair's hanging down. It curls and falls all down her breast. See for me that her hair's hanging down.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Pamela Yates, an award-winning film director and co-director of Skylight, a not-for-profit media organization that has over 35 years has combined cinematic arts with a quest for justice to inspire the defense of human rights. Among her films are When the Mountains Tremble, winner of the 1984 Special Jury Award at the Sundance Film Festival, Teatro, State of Fear, Granito, How to Nail a Dictator, for which she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, Disruption, and 500 Years. And she executive produced the Academy Award-winning documentary short subject, Witness to War. And her latest film, now opening across the country, is Borderland, The Line Within. Welcome to Background Briefing, Pamela Yates.
Thank you, Ian. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And your new film, Borderline, The Line Within, makes the point and makes the case that the border is not a geographic line, but rather a vast border industrial complex entrenched in every corner of the United States, and it's inside each and every undocumented person, because wherever they may be, the fear of being discovered and deported is looming. Yet in the shadows of the border industrial complex, they are quietly creating networks and building power. So this, of course, is a precursor, is it not, to a condition that could exist in infinitely worse than it is now if Trump were to be elected and to carry out his plans to deport over 20 million people. So it's sort of poised as a kind of warning, isn't it? Along with revealing stuff that I don't think most Americans know.
Absolutely. It is a cautionary tale. But I think the really hopeful thing is the stories that we tell of immigrants organizing, as you say, in the shadow of the border industrial complex. This was something that wasn't known to me. I didn't realize how networks were being created and built, and people were helping each other to survive and thrive in this country. Of course, what's looming large is the mass incarceration and deportation of immigrants. I think everyone everywhere feels that. But one of the ideas that we posit in Borderland, The Line Within, is actually that Republicans and Democrats agree on what has been the immigration policy in the United States, and that there has to be a movement, a grassroots movement from the bottom up to change that. And we're going to have to do that congressional district by congressional district. So there's a lot to unpack in this film. I tried to take the audience on a journey of discovery. I tried to have them understand, or I tried to reveal what was being revealed to me, to us as the filmmakers, as we were embarking on this 5-year effort to bring Borderland, The Line Within to the screens. And, you know, immigration has always been important and at the center of our national debate. But I can't imagine a more consequential time than right now for us to be seeing this, understanding how the billions of dollars in the border industrial complex, our tax money, is being spent on the backs, on the suffering of immigrants arriving in this country. That's the essence of the film, really.
But it would seem, though, Pamela, that your task is also to educate the American people, because the reason that the Democrats and the Republicans are sort of pandering in a way to get tough on the border, or who's the toughest on the border, has a lot to do with the broader public opinion in this country. that is fairly hostile to the border because of the demagoguery that's gone on. And people, like some of the people in the Trump administration, like Stephen Miller, etc. So the American people have to be educated, don't they, about what is really happening, and you have to put a face on the people who are being victimized by this cruelty.
You're absolutely right, Ian. And one of the ways I've been talking about this film and in conversations with public who've come out to see it across the United States, I wanted people to think about your own ancestors. Where did your ancestors come from, and how did you come to be in this country? Because I feel like it softens people's approach, this very hardline approach to immigration. And the blaming of the other, and all of our problems are because of immigrants. I want people to think about, okay, so who are your ancestors? Were you here in the United States when the conquerors came from Europe? Were your family members brought here as enslaved human beings from Africa? Or did your ancestors come from Europe? Were they fleeing the Holocaust? Were they fleeing hunger and starvation? Were they fleeing political persecution in their countries? Because all of us in our families, our immigrant ancestors are the hero stories. They're at the center of who we are and how we establish our identity. And when we think about that, maybe we can think about these $25 billion earmarked for the border industrial complex in 2024 being rechanneled into a welcoming of immigrants into this country. We have the ability to absorb millions of immigrants. We need immigrants in this country. We understand how immigrants have built this country, and those of us who are already here laid the basis for this country to be built. And it's a different way, a different angle, a different perspective of looking at immigrants. And when I ask people about their immigrant ancestors, it's always stories of resilience and intelligence and thriving and being part of who they are as Americans.
Well, but if Trump and Stephen Miller were able to enact this massive deportation, which would involve building concentration camps, and it would involve militarizing police and National Guard around the country, and people would be rounded up in every state in the country, and it would devastate agriculture in this country. It would devastate the restaurants and the hospitality industries. It would devastate the construction industry, just as a time when both Harris and Trump are campaigning on the need for housing in this country. America would really suffer a massive economic hit, and it would be very quick and real. Do you think that might be a wake-up call? And not that I'm in every way hoping that this doesn't happen, but the writing is on the wall. If Trump's elected, he's determined to do this.
If we want to avoid a humongous humanitarian crisis, we will not elect Donald Trump to be president of the United States. And actually, even though in the film Borderland, we posit the culpability of Democrats in the immigration policies as well, we know that with the Democratic administration, there's going to be room to move, room to dissent, room to pressure, and that is a way that we can act politically. We can understand locally who are working for and fighting for immigrant rights. We can understand locally how much money of the border industrial complex is going into our congressional district and what companies are profiting from the suffering of immigrants. But I totally agree with you. If Trump were to become president and enact immigration laws, and Stephen Miller, as the architect, were to massively incarcerate and deport people, it would create absolute chaos in this country. We can't have that. But, at the root of that, I think we have to understand that immigrants are not to blame for all of what's wrong in this country. In fact, they are to be given credit for so much of what has gone right, including an economic soft landing after the pandemic. We avoided a recession because of the people working in all kinds of jobs, especially essential workers. And that credit is due and has not landed.
But even from the day that he announced he was running, Trump, when he demonized Mexicans as murderers and rapists, lately on the campaign trail, he has amped it up, this racism, to unbelievable proportions. I mean, he continually says on the campaign trail that they're emptying the asylums, the criminals, the insane people, the rapists, they're all pouring into the country unabated. And it's just obvious what is happening here, that the Republican campaign and Trump's campaign is demagoguing and using the issue of immigration as a gateway to fascist ideology and political power, which is... this, in other words, they figured that this is the way to get elected. And as ugly as it is there a chance it could work?
Is it a chance that if he were to be elected?
No, is there a chance that are we as a society so far gone and lost our way in terms of decency and human rights that this kind of ugly fascist rhetoric, I mean, it's not different from what Hitler did about the Jews in the run-up to World War II. If this were to happen, in other words, do you think it's possible that the American people are susceptible to this kind of ugly propaganda?
I sincerely hope not, and I'm going to fight like hell up until November 5th using this film, because that's what I do as a human rights defender. I mean, my human rights practice is through the power of cinema. And we're going to use this film to educate, to activate, and make sure that that doesn't happen.
So in the film itself, you have an environmental defender from Guatemala who was fighting to protect his ancestral lands, and he was threatened with death, and he had to flee Guatemala. And he was in your previous film, 500 Years, and he's a writer, an important leader. So tell us about this character in your film and his story.
Kash Mural is an environmental defender. He's one of the lead protagonists in Borderland, The Line Within. And I met him because I was exploring the idea of the extractive industry growth in Guatemala on the lands where the genocide of the 1980s had taken place against indigenous people. And he was a leader in his community, and he was a member of the Ixil University, which is a Mayan university without walls in the Altiplano of Guatemala. So when he contacted me because his life was being threatened, I mean, I believe it's really important to stay connected to people and places where you've made films. I didn't realize then that he was going to become the lead protagonist in this film. But I felt really responsible to accompany him, to try to do everything that I could to keep him safe. So we began a series of WhatsApp messages. I think we traded 3,000 WhatsApp messages in his journey from Guatemala and his attempt to get into the United States. So he became a key figure. And it became clear to both of us, to both Kash and myself, that his story represented the story of thousands and thousands of immigrants. And that as such, he wanted to collaborate in the making of the film. And so he did. And so he is. But how many people, how many leaders, how many important figures have come to the United States fleeing persecution? I think that is always one of the things that makes us strong and vibrant. I live in New York City. New York City is 25% immigrant, and it has been for the last 100 years. And what does that mean? That means it's an incredibly vibrant city. It's culturally rich, gastronomically deep. And there's people working and bringing their families. And it's just made it one of the greatest cities in the world.
So just in the last minute, I wanted to talk about the film itself and the fact that you decided to shoot the film in widescreen, which means, of course, that it's best seen on the big screen, right? And you're on a nationwide tour. So tell us about how you filmed it briefly and how you want people to see it and where they can see it.
We really made Borderland, The Line Within, to be seen on the big screen. I worked with a great cinematographer, Juan Hernandez from Sonora, Mexico. And It's an epic story, and we wanted to give it that epic sense. I know a lot of people will see it on smaller screens and on their telephones. That's okay too. It's still important to bring the beauty of our shared humanity to the screen and to documentary films that deal with very difficult issues. We're right now on...
This is WMNF Tampa. The Skinny is coming up next after NPR News.